So the format of this panel is going to be like last time, which is to say that we have a set of questions that we're going to be asking, one question for all four people, and then go on to the next question. And we will save some time for audience Q&A at the end. We'll be ending at 4 p.m. This time for the audience Q&A, and I'll say this again when we get there, we're going to try having people not enter questions in advance like we did last time. Instead, we're just going to have people, when Q&A time comes around, enter their name in the chat as a way of kind of raising their hands, and the mod will call on them in order. And then when you're called on, you can turn on your mic, ask your question, and then turn your mic off again. Or if that seems too cumbersome, instead of entering your name, you can enter the text of your question in the chat, and then when it's your turn, the mod will read it on your behalf. If this system turns out clunky, we may switch back to just having people enter their questions in text. But we'd like to give the mic option a try, just to make it feel a little bit more like there are actually people in the room here. So I will repeat these instructions when Q&A time comes around. The other thing is, please don't use the chat for side conversations, because we kind of like to keep focus on the panelists' conversation. So do use it if you need to get the mod's attention for a technical question. And if you have a time-critical, like quick clarification question, somebody said a thing and I'm totally lost and have no idea what they're talking about, type that into the chat and a moderator will bring that verbally to the panelists when possible. If somebody does that, please don't start answering other people's questions in the chat. It kind of ballooned last time, and we'd like to try a different way this time. Okay, so with that, hi, I'm Andrea, she, her pronouns. I'm one of the Committee for Getting Things Done / officers of the Greater Boston LARP Society, and I will be moderating the panel today. Also here are, from the panel for Getting Things Done, are Kim and Wendy, and they will be helping with other moderator tasks. And with that, I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Edwin.
I'm Edwin, they, them pronouns. And is there anything else you need?
Could you tell us, sorry, I was going to ask you something and I forgot. Could you also tell us what your original LARP community of origin was, and kind of what your experience of writing is, briefly?
Mostly started in college. First UC Berkeley, then MIT with the MIT Assassin's Guild. Then went to Intercon, and mostly been Intercon since.
Okay. And have you written for any or all of those communities?
Starting with the MIT Assassin's Guild and Intercon, yes.
Okay, great. Let's go to Kate next. Kate, are you there?
I am. You looked at just as you said my name. Hi, I'm Kate Zadepski, they, them pronouns. I've been LARPing since about 2009, starting in also in Smith College theater style every other weekend at New World Homebrew Changeling LARP, which I first played for several years and then was involved for running for several years. I have also written a Iron GM game for Intercon in 2018, and another game that's run at Intercon and the Festival of the LARPs called Ilmet by Neon Light. My frequent collaborator Ace Talo is also here. We basically flipped a coin about who was going to be speaking here, so if I get anything super wrong, they can probably correct me there.
All right, great. Let's have Susan next.
All right, hello. So I'm Susan Weiner. Any pronouns are fine. And my community of origin is a little complicated. I started LARPing when I was 15 at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington, playing Vampire. And while I've stuck with some of that, I'm far more connected, I think, these days to the Brandeis and Intercon LARP crowds. And most of the games that I have written and run are, if not there, at least sort of in those crowds and in those circles. Nowadays, I live in Chicago, and I'm one of the organizers for BCon, which is the Chicago LARP Con.
Okay, and Chris.
Hi there. I'm Chris Shannon. I'm he, him pronouns. I started LARPing at Intercon. For ages, friends in the SCA tried to convince me to try LARPing out, and I was resistant for some reason. But finally, they convinced me to go, and I've been diving in headfirst since. I've written games for Intercon and other LARP festivals. I've also attended campaign boffer games in the New England area, specifically in the Accelerant community, which is a very specific set of rules. And I've written some short form boffer games. So I'm really interested in terms of my writing in the theater style and the boffer hybrid. So that's what I'm sort of representing here. The last game I wrote was at Intercon. It was a collaboration with for Stop That Moon, and that is a good example of a boffer and theater style hybrid game.
Okay, so since that segues neatly into my next question, we've asked each of the panelists to pick a particular kind of subgenre of games that they have experience writing that they're going to focus on today. I know many people have written in many different styles. We've asked everyone to focus on one because one of the reasons that we're doing these panels is to kind of get people talking about the different styles that are out there. So I am now going to ask the panelists to tell us a little bit about what the type of LARP they're going to be focusing on today is, and what are its most distinguishing features. And Chris, since you started talking about that, could you elaborate a little bit more on what the boffer theater fusion is?
Sure. So it's an interesting sort of fusion because these, for many years, were somewhat separate communities where a lot of the boffer community came from a campaign setting where they would have multiple weekend long games throughout a year and tell a longer story or work on different sort of campaign sessions. Whereas the Intercon theater style was usually one-shot games with a very specific timeline. Not that all theater games need to be that way, not that theater games can't be campaign games, and not that boffer games can't be short form. What has happened recently is there's been an interesting convergence of the two communities where theater style players have joined some longer boffer campaigns, and we are seeing a lot more boffer players at Intercon. And there's also been a resultant short form boffer game style where, and there have been all along, but it's become quite popular now that there's a track at Intercon of boffer games in the short form style. So I mean by that, a game that's either usually between 4 to 6 hours as opposed to an ongoing game. And some of the distinguishing features of this are because boffer campaigns often have a bring your own character rather than pre-generated characters, there is a certain amount of collaboration between the writers and the players, and often there are certain character elements that are created for the short form game. Not always, but for example, in Stop That Moon, we had a lot of player generated and new characters each session.
Okay, great. Let's see, Susan, can you tell us about your kind of game?
Sure. So I'm representing scene-based games, which, while I've written a lot of different games, I write with Alleged Entertainment, and I think that's sort of, if we're known for something, that's probably it. And scene-based games, there's a concept that there's usually, although not always, some sort of framing character where you have a base character that you're playing by default, but then during the game, there are scenes, and these scenes can be a lot of different things. Maybe you're playing a flashback where you're playing something that happened earlier in the character's history, or maybe you're playing out a story that some character is telling in some way, and so maybe you're playing completely different characters, and these scenes can range from, here's a little description of what happens and you sort of make it, as you go along, to here's some very detailed characters with maybe even a little bit of scripting to guide you towards the important points of this scene. And that those help inform in some way, what's happening in your frame characters and in the larger story within which these scenes are contained. Probably our best known example is Last Seder, but people may also be familiar with other people's games, like Across the Sea of Stars is another example of a scene-based game.
Right. Can we have Kate next?
Sure. I kind of struggled to come up with what to call the things, which I think might be a trend amongst all of us as we're trying to figure out how to define genres. In the end, what Ace and I came up with was character-driven theater LARPs. So again, one of the main things I've written for was a campaign style. It was a theater style. There was no bothing. And it was a bring your own people. The players were bringing their characters in. Which of course can feel very different to the collaboration of making a standalone one-shot where the GMs are creating the characters and having to figure out what the connections are kind of from scratch at go. But in both of those cases, we're really trying to write games where the story is driven by who the characters are and what their needs are, and where they are, I think they tend to be more linear. There's an event that is happening, there's a moment in time. In that kind of classic theater style thing, characters are going in with connections, with needs, with wants, and working towards something over the course of the game.
Thank you. And I've realized two things. One is that I was going to say to the audience in advance, but forgot, that as we're going along, I've asked the speakers to try to define some of the terms that they're using as they use them. But I also, because we have a kind of a mixed crowd, both in terms of what communities people come from and also what experience levels people have. And last time there were requests for terminology definitions. But that said, I also want to acknowledge that neither across individuals nor across communities do we actually agree on any of these definitions. And so when the writers are talking about definitions of terms, what they're really saying is that's what they mean when they say those terms. And you will almost certainly hear other people using those same terms and meaning something different. So just wanted to say that. And the other thing was, I have noticed that we have been using the word theater style and not defining it, and I thought Kate's semi-definition just now had more to do with actual theater than many other definitions I've heard, so I thought that was interesting. So Edwin, I think you are last to tell us about your game type.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about old school Secrets and Powers games, but more specifically, I'm going to talk about a very specific subtype of it. That's not necessarily true about all Secrets and Powers games. But old school, I'm talking about something prior to Jeep form or Nordic influences. Secrets and Powers, not every character knows everything about everyone else. There are mysteries to uncover. Powers, not everyone can do the same things as everyone else. But I also want to talk specifically about types that are very conflict-driven, a bit player versus player. They tend to be more mechanics heavy and tend to be written for more players. So those are very distinguishing features, especially when you're writing the game and something you actually have to plan for in the writing and collaboration process.
Okay, great. So with that, we'll move on to questions about collaboration, which is the theme of this panel, which I also forgot to re-announce at the beginning. So let's have Susan start this one. So who do you write with, and how do you select new writing teammates?
So it's interesting. For most of the time that I wrote, almost every game I wrote included Nat Uden, and almost everything I wrote included my my spouse Vito, and that has branched out a lot since I moved to Chicago, and everybody's gotten more busy and things have changed. And what I am looking for in a writer, in a collaborator, is someone with whom I share enough sort of vision and goals and values that we can strive towards a game that we'll both be happy, that we'll all be happy with, but who comes at it from different enough places that we don't wind up with too much groupthink. My preference in writing teams is somewhere in the 3 to 5 people range, because it's really easy for 2 people to fixate on one thing that makes perfect sense to them and no sense to everyone else. The other thing I care about in selecting people is that we have relatively compatible timing goals. Some people tend to like to do all of their work at the very end, and some people write great games and do that, but I cannot do that, or it will not work out well for me.
And one follow-up question, because you've covered some of the follow-up questions already. Besides compatibility in terms of work timeline, what kinds of skills or experiences or attributes do you think the team overall needs to contain for you?
Yeah, so as someone who has written a lot of LARPs, I really like working with newer writers, because I think, they'll have some ideas that wouldn't occur to me because I'm set in my ways, and I can sort of, help them get started and give them support as they're figuring some of these things that I've done a lot out. Depending on what type, like with a scene-based game, there usually aren't a ton of non-scene mechanics. If there are, I like having people who are going to help, at least one other person who thinks about mechanics a lot, because I want to make sure there's someone else who's double checking my mechanics. I'm happy writing mechanics, but I don't want to be the only person writing mechanics, because I can come up with, again, something that makes sense. And on the other side, I am someone who I'm really good at churning out a lot of material fast. I am not so good at going back and doing all of the consistency editing. I want there to be someone on my team who is really going to pay attention to that consistency editing.
Okay, great. And that's previewing some of our later topics, I think. Just quickly, can you give us a quick definition of mechanics?
Oh, sure. So mechanics are basically, to some degree, anything that you're doing that isn't just doing exactly what your character is doing at the time. The obvious ones are like, if you have combat, you need some sort, even if it's a buffer game, you need a combat mechanic to determine, how many hits can you take before you go down? Do you lose an arm under some circumstance? And if it's not a buffer game and you have combat, obviously you need some way of dealing with that. Even if you don't have combat, a scene is a mechanic. So if I have a scene and now I'm distributing characters to, mini characters to everybody, and everybody's coming in and playing a different thing, that is a mechanic, and we need to sort out what's happening there.
Okay, thank you. And since we're on mechanics, maybe I'll go to Edwin next, whose game type includes mechanics. So the question is, who do you write with, and how do you select new writing teammates?
I generally like different people on the team to have different specialties and be better at different things, if they're sort of complementary skills. some different perspectives and different blind spots, to be honest. I think a lot of individual writers have blind spots, and having people who can come in and identify those blind spots really helps. But largely, a lot of my experiences I will be tapped. Somebody will ask me to join their team because they want someone who's good at espionage or intrigue, and that's the type of thing that I might be asked to join a team for. I haven't done as much recruiting in the opposite direction, though.
Fair enough. And that sort of anticipates the question I was going to ask, which is, how do you find people to team up with?
Yeah, I don't have as much experience with that. I generally like just people who are good at different things.
Okay. And are there particular, like a particular skill mix that you think a team needs to be able to cover in order to write your kind of game?
You do need a mix of people for these type of games. You need a mix of people who are good at mechanics and people who are good at writing. Because you can't just do all mechanics GMs or all writing GMs. You kind of need both.
Okay, and I think we'll be coming back to that idea in later questions. Kate, let's hear from you next. Who do you write with, and how do you find people to write with?
Sure. I think I found all of the people that I've written with through other LARPs. I mean, that's, but the first team I wrote with was through this Changeling LARP, which I had played for a number of years, and who were being brought on board by the previous team of GMs. And that lineup changed somewhat over the couple of years I was involved, but came to be a really good team for a number of reasons, because we did find that we had skills that complemented each other, and learning. I think the really, really crucial thing to being able to have a team that works is having a shared understanding of what the game should feel like. And I think anything else kind of comes from that shared understanding. As long as you're starting from that point, you can figure out what gaps you need to fill, or come to agreement on things you might initially disagree about if you're working towards a common goal of how it should feel. And we, I think, got to be a really good team, knowing that, for example, I was the one who was probably going to be setting actual meeting agendas, and but that somebody else was probably going to be the one like really, really charging in on writing content. So we went from that. That was a team that knew we worked really well, is what went into doing Iron GM contest together. Because we already knew that we worked well as a team, we knew how to communicate with each other, and we knew how our different skills filled in each other's weaknesses. Like, we had at least two people who were phenomenal at taking a blank page and just zooming forward, which I have a lot of difficulty with, but I can, go behind and edit and make sure that things are pointing in the same direction, and that we're coming together with a game that feels like it is a cohesive thing, and not something, because it's five. We were a team of 5, and I agree. I think it was Susan who said that a team of around 5 is a really great, a great number if you're able to divide work well and able to understand what each of you is going to do and bring to the table. That's still a small enough number to actually be able to talk to each other and talk through something. So that's really phenomenal. And then otherwise, the other main game that has been completed was, again, with Ace Taylor, who's a member of both of those other previous teams, where we were coming back from another game, and it was a long car drive back, like you do, and we started talking about what something we would make would be. So perhaps a weakness of mine is, finding groups, finding people who have more different backgrounds, for sure. Because it's always been the sort of natural, this is the group that has already been kind of cohesively together.
Yeah. And I think that can be hard in the con system if you're kind of seeing people at conventions and not elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So Chris, who do you write with, and how do you select new teammates?
So echoing some of the other panelists' thought, a lot of the people I've written with are people I've gamed with, and people I have friends who I've also gamed with. So I tend to lean on some experience that I've had either as a player with other players or as a player with GMs or vice versa. And I think I've also been selected to be part of a writing team for the same sort of reason, where there's been a group that has said, you know, that I'd be useful either in terms of generated content or filling a specific niche in the team. So frequently it will be a sort of matter of there would be a need in a game, and thinking about which sort of person would be enthusiastic about filling that need and has the skills to fulfill that need is sort of one of the ways we go about choosing this. And in that choice, we start thinking about the roles players have had in games and the roles that writers have presented to players in games. So, for example, if there is a certain need to present puzzles in a game, you know, we want an element where there are a lot of like physical puzzle challenges, mental challenges for a player to complete. There are some players and some GMs that I know are particularly good at assembling those. They're good at codes, they're good at logistics, they're things like that. And they can present a good puzzle game. And that's something I am terrible at. So when I'm trying to find a co-writer, I'm thinking about someone who's got a very strong and very different mind or personality from me that I still really get along with pretty well, and forming a pretty good team around that. One of the things that I tend to I tend to be a very big thinker in terms of grand schemes and themes. So having someone who can edit me down is very, very useful. Otherwise, the ideas behind the game spin out of control. So finding someone who's enthusiastic about my idea, but knows that I shouldn't be doing everything, is a great asset in my writing team.
All right, thank you. So some of you have touched on this question already, but and also I know some of you have written both collaboratively and solo. I'm not sure that's true of all of you, but you may still be able to address this question, which is, other than the division of labor, you know, there's more people, we can split things up. What are some of the benefits to collaborating versus writing alone? So let's start with Edwin this time.
I've seen a lot of solo games that I would describe as brilliant but flawed, and that's because one author can sometimes miss a flaw that a different author might be more able to spot more easily. And so I think in some ways collaborative games are much more robust in that way. The challenge is that solo games are much easier to have everyone agree on vision because there's only one author. In collaboration, you have to get everyone to agree on the vision. So it's a trade-off there. But I think collaboration does ultimately win, but you have to agree on that vision.
Okay. Kate, do you want to respond to that question?
Sure. And you know, one thing here is I have actually never successfully completed a LARP on my own. So I think a big thing collaboration gives you is accountability. Even if your deadline is fake, you've got another human who is expecting you to have something done by whenever you're meeting next or whatever you're putting together next. So, and I also agree with Edwin that having that you can catch a lot of flaws if you just have even one other pair of eyes on something. And arguably, having multiple people, while you have to hammer out what is the vision, what should it feel like, you have that confirmation that you have just a little bit more confirmation that your finished product does feel like that to somebody else's brain.
Okay. Chris?
Okay, so I've actually written a couple of games solo. So I actually do have experience with having written that. There are a lot of advantages to writing as a collaboration. It's not just the different points of view. The game that gets finished when you're writing collaboration is going to be richer and more varied and will appeal to a wider variety of people and can have a wider set of point of views, which is important with LARP because unlike other things, one of the main features of LARP is that everyone is a main character. Novelists or writers will tend to focus on 1 or 2 or 3 character stories. So unless your game is about 1 or 2 or 3 characters, it's helpful to have other people providing the scope and the wide field of, well, what's in it for this character and this character, and how are they all main characters? Having multiple writers really helps with that aspect.
Yeah. And I think Susan is the last person for this question.
So I've written a number of solo games as well. And sort of my requirement to write something on my own is that it has to be simple, which doesn't necessarily mean the number of words that I'm writing. I'm very capable of generating words, but if there's complex mechanics or a complex web of character ties, or a bunch of pre-written scenes that I have to make sure all work together and make sense, I really want other people to check those things and make sure that it makes sense to someone who isn't me and can't see into my brain. That the games that I write alone either are sort of workshoppy games where you figure out a lot of things as you go, or are what I call, what I've been referring to as slice of life games, where it's like, here are this set of people in this room for this relatively short period of time. There's little to no mechanics, little to no anything besides these relationships. So it has to be simple for that to work. Otherwise, I know I'm going to miss things. And something's going to sound great in my head that doesn't work.
So it sounds like you're saying you might be unlikely to write a scene-based game just by yourself.
Yeah, unless it was heavily. I have one that is a scene-based game that was solo written, Sitting Shiva, but that's a heavily workshop-driven game. It doesn't have pre-written scenes.
Sure. Okay, so the next question is a little bit broader, and you've started talking about it, all of you already, which is, so you've kind of all said that when you're writing a game collaboratively, there needs to be a group vision that everybody agrees on. And so when you're working with others, how do you come to that shared agreement or vision about what the game should be like when it's done? Which can mean a lot of different things. You know, what does it feel like? Goals, themes, how you're going to handle safety and consent, you know, how complicated it's going to be, kind of all of those aspects of the game. How do you come to a shared vision with your collaborators? Let's start with Kate this time.
So the time that I have the clearest example coming to this was really with the Iron GM game, because also we had so little time to do it that was a defined conversation and moment in time, where we had the outside prompt giving us, you know, genre. We already had established how many characters it's going to be, but it was that first conversation saying we want people to walk away from this feeling some catharsis and some feeling of being uplifted. We want it to have a sense of humor, but we don't want it to just be, you know, silly bonkers, you know, whatever going on. And then everything else that we were putting together from that really was going back to, does this match that feeling of what the game should be like? With the ongoing game which had existed before we as GMs were taking charge, that had already in its own way shaped what we wanted it to feel like. Because we were coming in, many of us as former players, going, these are the frustrations I had, you know, in many ways, in the same way that the thing that inspires people to write fiction, where you've already had a lot of experience of this thing and you can see all of the gaps that could make it stronger, and you have a framework for that discussion of what you want to see be different, and the ideas that you have that have never been introduced to that. Which I believe we actually did a lot of like sticky note exercises of, you know, having time when different different gems were, you know, working, just putting concepts on sticky notes and then putting those out for everyone to see, and seeing, okay, here's the overlap of the pieces that we're finding, and here's something that's maybe on the fringe, so we need the person who put it in to talk more about what they actually meant by it and whether that's something the rest of us agree about or not. From there, I think a lot of what makes it work is building a structure that lets the creativity happen. So things like having established meeting times, whether they're regular or, you know, I think especially with a two-person, that can be much more like, okay, we've reached this point, we need to find another time to check in. Having a clear way that you're documenting what you've done before with it, just overall, you know, having really clear expectations of what different people are actually going to do to make this work, because you never want, you know, you have a great brainstorming conversation and you've got all of this energy about where things are going to go, and if you just walk away, you're going to have, I think, half the people crank out some stuff and half the people not really know where to start, and then that's when you start getting people feeling like they're either not part of the team, feeling like they're shouldering different amounts of work. But if you take that moment where everyone's really energized and you start with, what are our action items? What are we doing next? When are we meeting next? What are we having by it? That can really harness that collaborative energy into something really happening.
Great. Susan, could you go next? How do you come to group consensus on what the game should be like?
Sure. That can vary an awful lot. I'm probably said this in some ways, but I am an idea generator. And so one thing that I have in fact, a page of ideas for LARPs that may or may not ever get written. And so frequently what will happen is, you know, I'll be, well, we want to write a LARP together. Well, let me go to my page of LARP ideas and see if any of these are things that we want to work on. And then we'll see if we need to recruit anybody else. So like Nat and I, if we're writing together, we'll go to that page and toss around ideas. And then we'll recruit people in. And then it's sort of, okay, so then we've got this base framework of, okay, so we want to write a game where you're all the same person who died in different universes, and we're retelling the stories of how you lived. Okay, great. So now what does that mean? And then we can have, you know, we'll have several conversations about, is this funny or is this serious? Is this, you know, what are our goals? What's the feel of this game? What do we want people to experience in this game, and what do we want to take away from it, before we even start getting into like, all right, well, what's actually happening during this game? What do players do? You know, and do we need, you know, and starting to get into some of those more detailed questions. Do we need mechanics? What sort of connections? How long do we want these character sheets to be? Is this a half page or is this a 20 page? What are we talking about? You know, and getting some of those details hammered out, and that helps feed into this vision. But the big thing is sort of having like, what are our big goals? What's the feel of the game? What do we want to accomplish with this game? What's the player experience of the game? Before we get anywhere close to thinking about what the materials we're working on look like.
And you said one thing I wanted to follow up on quickly. So if you're in a situation where you and Nat, or you know, somebody that you've worked with before and kind of have some shared process assumptions with, are then recruiting more people to work with you, like, have you been in the situation where you're recruiting somebody who has not worked with you in your process before, and you kind of have to integrate them or adjust to them?
Yes, absolutely. And we talk everything through, but the truth is, if Nat and I are working with somebody, Nat and I have a structure we like to work in terms of how we think about meetings and how we think about what's getting done and how we sort of go through our process. And kind of the truth is, doesn't have to be this way with everybody, but if Nat and I are working together, someone else is kind of coming into our process, because we've just worked together that much. That's not always how it works with other people, but that is how it works with Nat and I.
Okay. Edwin, how do you get a team to a shared vision of what the game will be like?
Well, first of all, there's issues of format, and some of that's sometimes predetermined based on the venue. Are you running an Iron GM game? That lot's already preset for you. Are you running a game for a 4-hour slot in Intercon? That's preset for, I mean, what you have in mind for that? But beyond that, I'd actually say that some of those decisions are delayed a little more than what Susan said. I delay them a little more because it's mixed in with what's going on, what it wanted to feel like, because some of the plots might change the feel of the game somewhat. There has to be some flexibility there. But largely, you get a bunch of people together, give them all a voice, have them argue it out. Just voice their opinions and be willing. People need to be willing to withdraw their ideas if other people don't like them. Just not get too attached to their brainstorming ideas.
Do you have, kind of group processes or group conversation facilitation processes that help that work and deal with what happens when people aren't letting go or have irreconcilable differences?
Largely, if people are not letting go, my question to ask is why? Why do you feel that way? Why do you think this is a bad thing? Why do you think this is a good thing? Why do you think this will work? Why do you think it won't work? And then if you examine into that, that's actually a lot of room for a compromise. If you identify specifically what the issue is, you can have a compromise that addresses that specific issue.
Okay, great. And I think Chris is the last person on this one.
Okay, so going in a kind of a different direction, one of the things that was really useful is sort of mining the enthusiasm of some of the other writers for me. During sort of a brainstorming period, we can sort of define a little more about necessarily what the genre or what the specific kind of goal is. For example, in Stop That Moon, it's sort of a, yes, it's a superhero. It's a Golden Age kind of superhero game. Specifically, Golden Age Sentinels kind of superhero game. So whenever we get stuck or something, get trapped in a spot like that, we can sort of go back to that and fold the enthusiasm of players into that, or writers into that. But I found that a lot of the sort of management of expectations or the management of the vision for the game happen from the initial brainstorming that happens during the initial writing process. Sometimes, if it's a fairly new game, that's coupled with the questionnaires that come in. Because if you're writing characters for players specifically, or for what the players are looking for, you're taking their input in as well. And to a certain degree, in some games, the player input, the players become a collaborator in the writing process. And that is, and you sort of need to fold in whatever they've written into their questionnaire or what their expectation of your grander ideas are within your own sort of vision or scope. So the brainstorming process at the beginning and the ongoing brainstorming for the individual encounters or scenes that happen within a game, because boffer theater hybrids are very encounter oriented or scene oriented. That sort of enthusiasm and that sort of that's the time to sort of really sort of focus in on how people are handling the different chunks and the different encounters of the game. Someone will have a very specific idea about, I want some sort of encounter involving this sort of monster. And so encouraging them to say, okay, tell me more about that monster. How does that fit into, Golden Age superheroes? And building that up has been really useful. And a lot of that's happened over GChat or chat, which is kind of an interesting brainstorming, different format than a traditional.
Did we lose our moderator?
You lost one of your moderators, yes.
Oh my.
Very, very frustrating.
Do you have a next question for us?
I know where the list is.
I have the list.
Believe that Wendy also would know where the list is. Hold on a moment.
Can you describe what your collaboration process looks like is the next question.
So can you describe what your collaboration process would look like?
Who's up?
Chris, why don't you take that? You were just talking.
Okay. So among this, how do you divide the workload? Do you plan everything in advance or divide it as you go? Do you provide feedback and revisions on each other's work? How do you set expectations around this? Okay. So what does the collaboration look like? Primarily, it is, I found that it's largely a as-you-go kind of situation. There is certainly a division that happens at the initial point of the game where there's a certain amount of setup and things that need to happen with the other writers and collaborators. Once you've got sort of a pitch for the game and once you've got enthusiasm and ideas going, there is some division and some thought about what sort of corners of the game people are going to sort of specialize in. Whether it's character history creation, or whether it's going to be mechanics or some of the encounters, some of the feel for the world, things like that. In a lot of the short form boffer theater collaborations, there is there's a lot of teamwork that needs to go on. In some other games, I've had better results. Working from a distance or working with a loose team. But particularly with buffer games, I found we need to have in-person meetings to help really iron out some of the mechanics and some of the division of labor. So the collaboration will involve a sort of a series of online discussions, different sort of bits of enthusiasm, and then after that, some in-person meetings where we actually try to focus those bits of enthusiasm into scenes and mechanics that work and player histories that work.
So same basic question to Kate.
Okay, yes. I agree with much of what has been said already. I think that a big part of making that success is having again, I've talked about a framework of things like having meeting times, having an actual agenda, even if the agenda is literally just, I don't know how to make this backstory element work, help. Right? Or we know that these characters need this many connections, but I've written myself into a corner and this doesn't work between these two characters anymore, help. But even just having that amount made clear, I think makes a meeting feel like, it allows you to feel like you've actually accomplished something. I've had decent success with meetings at a distance, provided that they also have more of a structure and are making sure to go through, say, going through someone's on point, going through each person's name at the end and making sure that every member has had the opportunity to comment on a topic that has just gone by. But as far as the actual plotting and getting the work done, I have also tended to operate more as needed. I think, again, yeah, in that first meeting where there's a lot of brainstorming and collaboration, that may lay out sort of the bulk of what people are going to do initially, but anything else really has to be assigned on the fly as you find the shape of the game and as you run into things that you couldn't have expected in trying to make it work. just trying to make sure I didn't miss anything else about that question. Oh, feedback and revisions. Absolutely do feedback and revisions of each other's work. I think that the best collaborations I've ever had are always ones where people kind of trust each other when they're saying no to something. Sometimes, I mean, we've seen this in plenty of movies, right, or TV shows where you really, or famous authors who get to write whatever they want, and you really wish they had an editor. So having people that you trust to tell you no sometimes, and who trust you when you have to tell them no, I think makes for a better game. Even if that does sometimes require that longer conversation about why did you want to do this? Are there parts of this that we can incorporate doing that kind of yes and conversation about it? But also to make a cohesive game, I think you really do need to have, or at least what I've seen has benefited from the ability to go over each other's writing and to be editing each other's work, and until there's something that feels like it was written by the same person. And so that a person doesn't get a character sheet and a blue sheet that just don't fit together, they don't make sense together. Or two characters who are supposed to be best friends don't have totally different understandings of what their past relationship was.
Yeah, I guess Susan, please answer the question.
My brain is a really, really disordered place, which means that I tend to put a lot of structure in place around it so that I don't wander off into everything else. So I have a very sort of, and Nat and I have often worked in this very sort of structured concept of how I work through the processes of getting one of these type of LARPs written. And it starts with, well, you start with your brainstorming and you figure out where you are and your goals and your vision and all of that. And then the next question, and this is a meeting, and you have one or two meetings of that. And the next question is, what information do we need to have figured out to propose this game for the con we're planning to debut it at? Because that's almost always how that works. So, okay, so here's the stuff we need to figure out. Can any of that be assigned between meetings, or do we need to have it all in meeting talking? Okay, so once we've done that, well, now, what are the things that we need to figure out to get to the point where we can start writing? Well, what are the first things we need to write? Are there blue sheets that we need to write before we can get to characters? Well, then can we make those decisions so that those can be assigned to someone to write between meetings? Okay, now that's done. So now we're on to character writing. We assign the characters, and every time that someone writes something, they bring it back to the meeting. And this is my favorite thing that we do about this. If anyone else, I love this system. So at a meeting, if you have at least 3 writers on your team, one person wrote the thing, the character, the blue sheet, whatever. Person A wrote it. Person B reads it. Person C is actually in the document doing the edits. So the person who wrote it is not either the one reading it or the one doing the edits, which means they can't sort of automatically smooth things over in their head, which tends to help tax a lot of those small issues. With scene-based games, there's a big thing to decide on in how you write the scenes, because there's 2 different ways to approach these scenes if they're pre-written. One, in terms of division of labor. One is, this is my scene and I'm writing everybody in it. And the other is, this is my character and I'm writing the person they play in every scene. And so deciding, sometimes one of those is a better fit for your game, depending on whether like perfect coherency within that scene is the important thing, or whether the tie between the character that is playing it in all of these scenes is the important thing. Because either way, you're going to lose a little. You try and tie it back together as best you can, but you know you're going to lose a little bit one way or the other. So picking which of those is best for this specific game is really important with scene-based games.
Okay, and same question for Edwin.
I think about starting with you, a bunch of people getting together and all arguing together about figuring out what the pieces are, write all those pieces down and all the things that need to be done, and people claim them. It generally goes in some sort of Google Doc or something, and just, it could be sheets that have to be written, whether it's character sheet or mechanic, or whether it's props that need to be picked up, or any deadlines that need to be met. Any task that needs to be accomplished goes on that list of things that need to be done, and there is a name that goes by it that people sign up to do it. And if there's no one signed up to do it, then we need to like find out, okay, who wants to sign up to do this? So that's that stage where you do that. And usually that goes pretty smoothly. There are a few things that are left unassigned, and we can generally figure out someone to do those. Then there's the next stage that once you have some things written, you have to read the things that somebody else did. And that's really important. That's the whole point of collaboration, is catching each other's mistakes. For smaller groups, this can happen fairly spontaneously. For larger groups, sometimes you can do a reading party where you print things out, you hand them around in a circle, person after person makes notes in the margins on the sheet, and then when you're done, you discuss that. So that's another way of doing things. Editing can vary from group to group. I tend to prefer people suggest edits, and that for anything more than just a typo or a grammar mistake, be done by the original author, ideally. But you can definitely, anyone can suggest edits, and then we can discuss it.
Okay, and I think that Andrea's back now and can take over the moderating.
Yes, I am. Sorry about that. Our house electricity just went out. So the next question, and I feel like the answers to the previous question started getting into this a bit, is what tools do you use to manage the writing process? How do you track progress and determine if you're on track to meet your intended completion or run date, or kind of, getting the thing finished? And also, kind of to manage some of those process things that you were talking about, both, making sure stuff gets done, but also making sure stuff gets done the way everybody wants it. Let's start with Susan.
What tools? The answer is Google Drive. And that and calendar invites. We do tend to sort of, once we've gotten like past the blurbing stage, have a, okay, here are the things, write out everything that needs to be done. These list sheets need to be written, these character sheets need to be written, these scenes need to be written, these mechanics need to be developed. And then, once they're assigned, we can record who's doing them. We can get date, like we can, if we're worried about timing, we don't always do this, but worrying about timing, we can set like we would like to be done with characters by, X time before the con, so that then we can edit them and be working on, and send them out and be working on scenes only after that, that sort of thing. So we'll often have we want the first drafts done by this point so we can have an accurate casting questionnaire, so that then we can edit them while we're getting the casting questionnaire responses and then send them out. That's an approach that we like doing if we can.
Edwin, you want to talk next? I think you're muted.
Wait, whom?
Yes, you. Sorry.
Okay. I didn't hear who. So I kind of already addressed that previously. Sorry. Yeah, I like putting everything that needs to be done down in Google Docs, and things available on Google Drive. And people are usually pretty happy to claim stuff they're excited to do. In fact, people might actually argue about who gets to do something, because they both kind of want, oh, I wanted to do that. But you kind of encourage people to actually do the things they're signed up for, and not sign up for too many things and then don't actually follow through, because sometimes you need to take stuff away if it looks like that's happening. But mostly you track each other's progress. I guess I have a tendency to do that myself. and just kind of see how things go. Because I always get nervous about deadlines, so I'm the one who always has an eye on that. I guess that's somewhat my role on teams sometimes. But yeah, you have a list, you check the list, and you check that the list is sane, you check that the list reflects reality.
Okay. Chris?
So yes, Google Drive, absolutely. But from the beginning, spreadsheets are magic. Having a spreadsheet is just so essential, or several, in fact, to cross-check the fact that the players have their needs met, that the props are collected, whatever it might be. The spreadsheets will be open in my browser when I'm writing at least 2 or 3 at any time, as well as any other writing document I'm using. And frequently they're used to double check connections or collaborations or who owns what. One of the things that we've done, particularly with Stop the Moon last game, which I'm representing, was that we had the writer's name next to each player and each character, just to show who owned that. And, you know, right up until the last month, there were a couple of players and characters that had no writer's name next to it because we were still trying to figure out, okay, which one of us will have the time to work this up a little more fully. We had like blurbs put together, but actually writing the full history on a couple of the characters took a little while. So having that there as a constant reminder, oh yeah, there we go, was very useful. So having a master spreadsheet and a checklist like that is vital.
All right. And Kate?
Yep, very much seconding tons of use of Google Docs and Google Sheets. With a larger group, I also did find Trello to be very helpful. There was a point in time with the longer running game where we were rewriting all of the mechanics and trying to put things in a way that would be accessible and understandable to all of our players, which could have a quite large turnover year to year, but we usually had 20 plus people at a time. And having something that was segmented out, which had a deadline attached to it, which could have a human attached to it, that we could see and move from what status it was in, whether it needed to be reviewed by other people, or whether it was still in a drafting phase, was a super useful visual tool. Other than that, yeah, we tons of use.
Right. I mean, do you want me to put my speaker, or are you?
I can.
Okay.
Tons of use of the.
I can find my headphones, which I misplaced during all the running about.
Ace did some fantastic math to find how many connections, how the different characters should be connected with each other. That first time we did it, it was displayed on a whiteboard that the cat sat on a whole lot. But then when we were doing this for Ilmet, this got transitioned into a Google Sheet. And sheets were also what we were using to tell, okay, this character is a member of this group. Oh, this group has fewer characters than others. We need, or like different characters need to be a member of so many groups so that they have a reason to know these other characters for a certain amount. And having that kind of visual display was great.
Sorry about the background noise there. I have lost track. Susan, have you gone yet? Okay, I think all 4 of you have gone on this question. Raise your hand if you have not gone. All right. So next question, how do you recognize when a collaboration is going badly? And we didn't put this as an explicit follow-up question, but the follow-up question is, what do you do about it? Let's start with Edwin this time.
I don't think I've ever had a case where collaboration has gone badly where it wasn't obvious, at least upon reading other people's sheets. But then again, I do tend to work with people who are very opinionated and very vocal about their opinions and don't really hide their opinions. So I can imagine that being an issue on teams, but I tend not to work with teams like that. But yeah, it's usually pretty obvious, especially when you start reading other people's sheets and you start seeing inconsistencies and start discussing them.
And so what do you do when that happens?
Well, depending on how large the team is, if it's small, you can probably raise any discrepancies in real time. If it's large, you might have to write them down and bring them up in a meeting and like sort of have an agenda point by point of what to discuss. But largely, I mean, it's very similar to other disagreements. Okay, why do you feel your way? Why do I feel my way? Is there room for compromise, or is there a way that fits the two things that we're both concerned about? Are we really disagreeing here?
Okay. Chris, do you want to take this next? How do you recognize when a collaboration's going off the rails, and what do you do about it?
Usually when a collaboration is going badly, there is some sort of gaping hole in the writing, or there's a character, or there's a plot that's not making sense, or there is something that we're waiting on that hasn't been fulfilled. There is something in the deadline or the checklist or the spreadsheet that is like the stumbling block for a lot of other things. And that's either there's some writing that needs to be done, or there is a point where someone waved their hand and said, magic happens here. And that needs to get filled. Typically in a case like that, that is a problem with almost, in those cases, almost all the writers at that point, because there is something that they're overlooking, or there's something that they're hoping someone else will take care of. And generally, I think that requires an actual in-face meeting at that point, and talking about whatever that hole is and trying to get past that. If it's often I've found it's like in the not the end of the game, it's not the start of the game, it's not the right after the start. It's like the third act. There is something in there that needs to get ironed out. And there's some sort of process that where the game has to go from the start to the conclusion that needs to get worked out, and that really requires an in-person meeting and some sort of actual collaboration at that point. So yeah, encourage collaboration by getting together in person.
Susan, how do you recognize when a collaboration is going badly, and what can you do about it?
Sure. So the two things that I think of first in this are either the standard classic group work problem of someone just isn't getting their assignments done. And that is definitely a thing that I've seen happen. And that is then the rest of the group has to talk with them and say, like, hey, do you still want to be involved in this project? If so, please do your work. If not, please leave so that we can decide whether we need to replace you. Or do we need to renegotiate your role or whatever, because that is a real issue. And it requires a very head-on tackling if somebody just isn't getting their work done. The harder one is the personality conflict one, where people are just at loggerheads and in ways that are hurting each other and potentially also the game. Like, people disagreeing is fine. That's part of the process. That's good. People should disagree. But when different communication styles come into play, sometimes people can't disagree without hurting each other. Some people are much more aggressive than other people, and sometimes that causes problems. I once was in a peaky group, which means that we were sort of tossed together, at an event. And most of those have been great, but there was kind of a known missing stair tossed into that group. And that made everything a lot more complicated. And some people sort of, we struggled to make that work. Not the game. The game was fine. We wrote a great game, but people came out getting hurt. And I think that's the harder one to solve. I don't, if anybody comes up with a great solution for that, let me know.
Well, Kate, you're going to tell us the great solution, right?
I wish I knew that. I would love to hear that too. I think I've been pretty fortunate in having a lot of really good collaborations. The two experiences I've had where the games I would call failures are actually both before I took a management class in grad school, and I really think that is a big factor in figuring out how to do the thing. I think my personal experiences of when things have failed have usually been either a gap in knowledge of the people trying to make it work, or a gap in the vision. So one of these was a two-person attempt to write a reacting to the past style game. So these are educational, historical games where we had this idea for what it was, but we didn't have an idea for what it would feel like. We didn't know what mechanics could work. We didn't have anybody additional on the team who knew how those things worked. We had tons of examples of finished products and no way to actually make the tension of the characters work, no matter how much research we did. It didn't turn into, like, we had character sheets written, but I don't think it never became a functional game. And then another one, which was supposed to be an ongoing, it very briefly lived, ongoing Dark Heresy inspired LARP, which was a mistake for many of its own reasons. But the point where it failed was that there really wasn't a shared vision. There were overall 3 GMs who stuck with it, each running basically a different game, and other people who were coming and going. So, you know, one person would join and be like, oh, this is the glue, this is the thing that's going to make it work. And then life events would happen and that person would leave. And where we really struggled was things like coming to what seemed like a consensus at a meeting, only for another GM to do something totally different at the game, which was an ongoing campaign style game, you know, introducing a character we hadn't decided was going to show up, introducing a concept that wasn't supposed to be there yet, and not necessarily telling the other GMs. And so then you're hearing about what's going on from the players. So I think that the ways things fall apart are also different for finite, you know, theater style single run games and for ongoing games, right? Because if you're writing something that's a finite thing, you're probably going to figure out before it turns into a game whether it's going to work or not. But there's plenty of things that you can also just, you know, charge in and try to do, and only and find out that the pieces don't fit together at the point where it's already happening.
Great. And you're just making me think that although there are more opportunities in a campaign game, I did actually have a collaboration experience where, in a last minute push to get the game finished, somebody did put something in game, ostensibly with permission, but the rest of us thought we'd agreed to something else, and only kind of found out later that there was a thing that we didn't realize we'd signed off on. So it can happen in a one shot as well. So the last question, and this is more sort of we're asking you to speculate, and again, we're not asking you to, you know, solve all the world's problems here on the spot, but just to, you know, hear your thoughts off the top of your head about how we as a community, whether that's the Greater Boston LARP Society, because this is something we're particularly interested in, but also the greater Intercon community, the greater LARPing community, you know, however you want to define that, how we as a community or as individual writers can encourage collaborations that include new writers, and that attract writers from a broad spectrum of backgrounds, both in like the demographic sense and also in the sense of what LARPing community they come from. So that's very big and complicated, but I would love to hear your ideas. Chris, why don't you start?
Okay, so in some ways, the style I'm representing is an attempt to do that, because it is a attempt to bridge the two communities. One of the things that is often best about this is that if both communities start thinking about, well, what if this theoretical theater game or this situation actually used live combat rules? You know, there's no, in some cases, live combat is not going to work for a game. We don't want that as an element. That is not what this game is about. Combat is not important in this game. There's no reason. It will not make the game any more meaningful. In some cases, you've got a bunch of characters who should be familiar with combat, and combat can provide a meaningful character development and a portrayal for some. One of the reasons why short form buffer games can appeal to a theater player is that the combat becomes immersive. After a game, there is a certain feeling that, yes, I did what my character would have done. I physically actually did this action, whether it was swordplay or gunnery or whatever you added into there. That got resolved in a quick fashion, and that was in a meaningful way. And that is something that is very specific about, I think, the short form buffer genre, is that the combat has to be meaningful and thoughtful. And that's something that doesn't happen in the larger games. So one of the things to do is to encourage theater writers say, well, have you ever thought about actually doing actual combat in your game? And to encourage the campaign buffer people to think about, this is a great idea that this encounter you had was, what if that was the entire story? You've got this wonderful encounter here. Have you ever thought about just writing this one encounter and making it a beautiful, perfect, short moment? And getting the two talking to each other and interested in each other has been an interesting process. And I think that the hybrid games have had a lot of vitality because it takes the enthusiasm to a degree from both communities.
All right, thank you. Kate, let's hear from you next.
Sure. So speculating on the theme of how could we, encourage collaborations and get more people involved. Well, most of my experiences have come of almost they've come through knowing each other through a game. So I almost wonder if there might be a way for, say, the Greater Boston LARP Society to do like game idea speed dating kind of style, right? If you've got a bunch of people who may have a bunch of ideas or lack thereof, but could get excited about ideas, and having that chance to sort of pitch things and see who's excited and who's maybe generating that energy that looks like it's going towards the same kind of goal. That might be the chance for people to meet folks that they wouldn't have otherwise, to consider collaborating with folks that they wouldn't have otherwise. I do think that can be more difficult in times where you can't meet in person, because I think that there is a really important element to forming a team that is a lot easier to do in person, even if you have to then do a lot of your work remotely. But maybe some other way of sharing when someone does have an inspired idea and is kind of open to who might be interested in helping make that a reality. Could be interesting.
Great. Susan?
So I actually have a very concrete proposal that I have suggested and would really love to see happen, although it has to be post-vaccine, which is, I mentioned briefly something called Peaky. It doesn't have to be exactly taken from the Peaky format. You can create your own, but Peaky is an event that happens in the UK and in the Midwest, where a bunch of people, generally something between, say, 12 and 25, come together for a full weekend. On Friday night, you brainstorm ideas. You come up with Peaky, P-E-A-K-Y. You come up with ideas, and these can be anything from ghosts to I want buffer combat in my game, to I want something light and funny, to I have this really concrete, specific mechanic that I want to get a chance to use. And you just put all these up like on whiteboards or whatever, and then people start looking at them, they start talking about them, and you start trying to piece some of these together into ideas. And you get ideas, and then you might say, well, we're going to have a buffer combat game where everybody are playing ghosts in this and it's going to be, you know, very light and fluffy. Like, okay, that's a game idea. And there might be a whole bunch of these different game ideas. And then people start saying, well, I'm interested in this one, I'm interested in that one. And you form teams, and you've got a moderator who's helping these teams form based on making sure that everybody has a game they want to write. All of the teams have a reasonable number of people, and at least one writer on every team is an experienced LARP writer, and especially if possible, someone who has done Peaky or Iron GM, that sort of short compressed writing format before. And then you spend the end of Friday night, like getting your first brainstorming done in your team. You write all day Saturday, and then you play test whatever you have on Sunday. And so it pushes people together with teams that they didn't know before, comes up with fascinating ideas, and it's a really, really great place for first-time writers, because they get sort of an experienced mentor who will be there, some push towards ideas, and if you don't come out of it with a game you want to run at the end, it's not the end of the world. You've spent a weekend on it, you've gotten the experience, and an awful lot of these games do go on, you know, they need some revisions afterwards, but at this point you've got a rough draft and you've got a play test.
Yeah, so someday when we can all meet again in a hotel. I have taken my eye off the ball. I think that Chris and Edwin still have to go. Is that correct? Okay. Chris, why don't you go?
Nope, I've already gone. It's Edwin.
Oh, you have gone. Okay. And Edwin, then go ahead.
Okay. This is a little awkward since I don't have specific solutions. That was just a very specific solution. So I'm going to talk about why is this problem hard in the first place. Largely, I think we talked about earlier about having shared vision, and a good way to make sure you have a shared vision is to work with someone you've already worked with before. But the downside of that is that you can get very insular and then it can almost tend to be a bit cliquish, and that is a downside of that approach. And so you do need solutions that mix things up, that introduce people to work together who might not otherwise work together. Another solution I've seen other than what Susan talked about, and I think that's a brilliant idea, and a different solution is a mentorship program for new writers. If somebody wants to grab a more experienced writer to write with, and somebody is a new writer, they want to get started and they need help, like mentorship programs can help with that. That's a different approach that I've seen.
And I think, in fact, we need a variety of approaches, because no single approach is going to work for all people or all games. So yeah, thanks for that. That was really just to, you know, get some ideas out in the air, and perhaps the audience has other ideas too. So at this point, we're going to move on to the audience Q&A session. As a reminder, the event runs till 4 p.m., so we have half an hour to play with. We're going to, so if you would like to ask a question, type your name into the chat if you would like to verbally ask it yourself, and we'll call on you, and then when you're called on, unmute your mic, ask the question, and mute your mic again. If you would rather have us read the text of your question, enter the text of the question into the chat, and we will read it for you. So I don't need to mute myself when I'm trying to call on people. That's counterproductive. First question from Olivia Montoya.
Hi. So I'm currently solo writing 2 games, but like I really want to work on games with other people. The problem is, like, even I've had trouble even finding people who like to read over the games that I'm currently writing. And like just to like get someone another set of eyes on them. And there's a couple problems I have with that. Like the people who I know, who I'm close to, who know the system that I use, are generally want to play the game. So, but I specifically want to eventually team write a game using the MIT Assassin's Guild style, and I'm already familiar with using game tech, but a whole lot of other people are not familiar with game tech, which is it's based on law tech. It's like for typesetting and like switching in and out pronouns and like information like that. You can it's sort of hard to describe to people who aren't familiar with it, and it took going through sort of a boot camp to learn how to use it. But I don't have a lot of personal connections to the MIT Assassin's Guild. I learned how to use this style at the Stanford Gaming Society in California, and I live in Connecticut now. And so either the people I know from that, so basically I'm having trouble finding people, and I don't know who to, either they want to play the game, I'm not close enough with them to really like ask something big like that, or I just don't know where to find people. So how do I remedy that?
And I will say, because you've reminded me of something that I thought was interesting when we were talking about tools. Everybody pretty much said use Google Docs, and Google Docs is great, but it is not the only tool out there. And there are, I was also amused because the last time I wrote a game with a big team, I was at MIT, and we were using, version control for checking in and out your software to version control our edits rather than Google Docs, which didn't exist at the time. So I don't know whether the panelists have thoughts about this or not, but it sounds like the question is about how to find people to help out in general, and in specific, how to find people who know how to use the Assassin's Guild idiosyncratic tech and game style. Would anyone of the panelists like to jump in with an answer to that? Edwin? Shockingly.
Coming from the MIT Assassin's Guild, I am, of course, familiar with game tech. And when I'm doing Iron GM games, one of the things we discuss is, okay, are we going to use Google Docs, or are we going to use game tech? I lean towards Google Docs as being a little easier for collaboration, but there's no reason why you can't have a version control repository and then compile game tech on your own computer. The big problem is that everyone has to have it set up for that to work. That's the big obstacle, and I think that's a big obstacle in an Iron GM game when you're very limited for time. So, but I definitely think game tech has a lot of advantages. But the prevalence of Google Docs has made those advantages less dominating.
And do you have any thoughts? I'll 1 sec. Do you have any thoughts about how to network with MIT Assassin Guild alum folks? I mean, I know that's a very woojy question, but
well, there's an MIT Assassin's Guild mailing list that you can ask on that mailing list, and some people might respond and say something.
Okay, well, so that might be something, Olivia, if you're willing to talk to one of us post panel, we might be able to hook you up. Kate had a response.
Yeah, so thinking purely of troubleshooting, how do I find people to help with this thing? It sounds like you've got a pretty clear idea of what you're doing and what you're looking for. And, at risk of something you've already thought of, I would say start brainstorming places that you can post that. Think of it like a job posting almost. So it sounds like there's a listserv specifically for that. So find out about putting on there. There's the Intercon Facebook group, and there's the Greater Boston LARP Society email list. So what are places that you can post that? You've already got a pretty succinct paragraph of what you're looking for. And also maybe ask on those lists if other people know additional places that could be put out to. The only other way I could think is maybe don't be afraid to ask, recognizing that it's a big ask, to the people you know, if someone would be willing to collaborate with you. I think that even if someone doesn't know you super well, being asked to try that out is kind of an honor, at least if you're recognizing the amount of work that it really is. And if you have a way to maybe send it out to a list of people who have already expressed interest in playing, you don't necessarily have to ask one specific person and put them on the spot. But saying, if we want to make this happen, just be clear that if they want to make this happen, you need that help and are looking for that.
Susan?
A few things. First of all, I think it's important to say, I think you have what is the harder ask backwards. I think that asking someone to review a game that you have already written is a much bigger and harder ask than, hey, do you want to come in on the ground floor and write an exciting game together? What you're asking is harder to find people for. And the other thing is, again, like I have literally occasionally posted on, I have a LARP filter on Facebook, posted on my LARP filter, like, hey, I'm looking for someone for this, just see who's interested. You can put that sort of thing up. I think you might have better luck with it than you think you would if you just do it and you're inviting people in on the ground floor to build something together.
Chris, for you?
Yeah. The last thing I'd like to add is just a lot of sympathy for the situation, because I have been in this situation where I've wanted to create a game, or I had an idea for a game and I tried to generate some enthusiasm and I wrote it alone. And sometimes that is the solution. I think one of the things that is important is to realize that, yes, you might have some friends that want to play this game, but you might need to lean on them once or twice to just sort of say, look, I know you love to play my games, but I'd like you to help me write one. I think that would be fun for you and be good for both of us, particularly if you have got friends in the community and friends that enjoy gaming. Some of them might want to switch roles, and you might not even realize it until you have the discussion.
Okay. If anybody else has questions, please do enter your name in the list. I actually had a question that came up when we were talking about one of the earlier things, which was, does any of you have experience with bringing a GM onto your team kind of like halfway through the process for whatever reason? And if so, can you tell us about sort of what the pros and cons of that are, and how you deal with it? Chris is making faces. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I've had some GMs come in, or some writers come in mid-game, and they've served as a really good reality check to what's been going on, and have very much helped with the editing process. There's a lot of lead up that has to take place to that, because often that person wasn't involved in the brainstorming or the original ideas or things like that. But that is one of the difficulties. But if you've got some people who are very enthusiastic about the game and can talk their game quite a bit, explaining that brainstorming is not that difficult. It's sometimes difficult getting us to shut up about the game. Yeah, bringing on someone particularly to work as a pared down editor has been useful, and as a reality check, it can be very good, particularly in, I'm going to say, the last month before the game goes on, or the last few weeks before the game goes on, because you've got material that you think is ready, but sometimes it needs another pair of eyes, and a group can become way too insular. So bringing in another writer or a editor or someone willing to at least take part in the game is really useful.
And I think I'm hearing you say a couple of different possibilities. One is that you can bring somebody on for a specialized role, like we want you to sanity check or edit or whatever.
Mhm.
And the other is more like bringing on a full-time person, but partway through the game.
Yeah, and sometimes you're not sure which role it's actually going to be until they step into that position. With the buffer hybrid, that's the other element is that the writers at some point need to bring in the other actors, cast, NPCs, whatever you want to call that term, the role for the people who are playing as the opposition to the PCs, and folding those people in is another part of the process. And so there is somewhere about a month or 3 weeks before the game goes on where you're incorporating a lot of people into and having them reread your documents. So yeah, that's a part of the process.
Okay, Kate, and then Edwin. Sorry. Oh, okay.
Sorry, mic issues for a second. I haven't had the experience of bringing a new writer in for a single run theater style game, but we did have to bring in new. There were lineup changes for the ongoing campaign game. So there we had the advantage of the person coming in was familiar with the game itself and how it worked and the concepts of the world. But a big important thing about bringing them on board was sort of making sure that the power differential worked out in the end, because if you've got people who have been doing this for a while, there's that feeling that they maybe have more ownership. And while someone coming on board certainly does need to learn, how do things work? How do I get at the places where we're drafting whatever we're going to do and planning and all of those pieces, it was also important to us that we didn't have, in our case, we didn't have like a head GM. We didn't have someone who had more power than the other people. So that was definitely something to pay attention to. And I think some just extra care in making sure that person's voice is heard as they're coming on board, and that they are given, training and mentorship for the technical pieces that they have to learn and be able to do that work.
Okay, and Edwin, go ahead.
Kate brought up some of what I was going to bring up, but a lot of that is about ownership. A lot of what you need to pay attention to. Sorry, let me just say that you need to be very clear when in a situation like this, what is set in stone and what isn't, because there can be a lot of disagreements because a new GM comes in and wants to change some things or it's kind of too late to change that. But you can avoid a lot of hurt feelings by saying it is too late to change these things, but we can still change these things. So you're not really stepping on toes too much for the old stuff, but the new GM does have some agency and some authority to change things. And so they're not feeling that they can't change anything. So hashing that out up front is really important, because I've been on both sides of this.
Susan, did you want to have a go at this, or?
It's been so long since I've been in a situation where this has happened. I don't feel like I have much to say.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so we have a question from Mallory saying, does anyone know of any LARP workshops that exist? I have a creative writing background, and that's a really common way for new writers to get motivated to write and to get critiqued, and also to meet other writers and get exposed to other writing styles. So we've already talked a little bit about Peaky and Iron GM, which are not exactly workshops in the way that this question is framing, but are opportunities for writers to get together and meet each other and learn from each other. I see Jeff Dewald is mentioning in the comments, bring your own game seminars. Panelists, do you know of other workshop or workshop-like events for writers?
I don't exactly, but I think the idea of a weekend of like, well, we're going to play test 3 different games and give them feedback and talk about it and play test each other's games sounds like a really cool idea if someone wants to organize it.
So that would be a workshop in the sense of like a writer's workshop where you bring your novel and people give you feedback.
I thought that was what this was asking about, right?
Yeah, quite possibly. I was just reading the text, so there's a little bit interpretation. Mallory says basically yes. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know that I have heard anybody talk about that, but that would be very interesting. And playtesting, or beta testing is a place, I think, where LARPing is different from fiction writing in the sense that you actually kind of like see it on its feet in action, and that gives you certain kinds of information. Does anybody else want to respond to this question about workshops or workshop-like things? Chris?
Yeah, I guess I would say that there is a sort of community playtest kind of a culture that exists where there will be occasionally people who are saying, well, we want to playtest this game. It's very informal, though, typically. And it's sort of like it has to happen among some friends where you're getting like a beta run of a game or something like that. And those people can sometimes be recruited to help actually run the game later. But it's very informal usually.
And I'm writing that down on my list of things Greater Boston LARP Society could think about doing sometime, because an official playtest, but that is run by a group rather than as a parlor thing, could be an interesting thing to do as well. I see Ace has a question. Do you want to go ahead, Ace? If you're speaking, you're still muted.
Ace, I think there might be something wrong with your microphone, but if you want to just walk over to my room from your room, that could probably work.
Oh, here we go.
Now my mic is also on.
Great. So my question is specifically for the panel. You've all written on games and created them. Part of a game writing process is having to kill your darlings, having to get rid of something that you absolutely love that it turns out did not fit in your game. In like a paragraph, can you tell me about one of them? Because I'm interested to hear, and I'm going to go run back to my headphones real quick. I know Kate's answer, so Kate should go first.
Okay, Kate, why don't you go?
I mean, my answer is when we were writing Ilmet, I had this idea for a character who was having two characters that were the same person at different points in time. And I was really excited to have it be about this character meeting their past or future self and like getting something that they needed from that interaction, either that they were going to be okay in the future, or just sort of something about how their past had gone. Unfortunately, there was no way we could figure out to write that didn't make one of them kind of not real, because any interaction they had with the past one was potentially going to change their future. And then also, you know, what year is everyone else in the game experiencing? And at the point where you do that, it was really important that all of the characters were equally real and not likely to sort of vanish. So it had to be turned into two actual different characters.
Time travel is one of the things that we keep wanting to put into games because it's great, and yet it's also impossible to actually do well, although not as bad as flight and invisibility, in my opinion. Susan, do you want to take a crack at this? You're making the face of can't turn on your microphone.
Sorry, I clicked away to actually go try and find some of my game ideas and think back and try and come up with things. I am someone who comes up with ideas real fast and is pretty happy most of the time to discard them just as fast. So I was trying to think of something that was core to an idea that I got rid of. I know with Death of Rivka, we were originally planning to, there's these characters who are all playing different aspects, different people, the same person who made different decisions, multiple universe concept. And the idea was originally that they would like choose which universe to be reincarnated on, and we didn't feel like the universes were different enough, so we had to sort of give up on that and just come back to like, do you want to recombine to create the next generation, or do you want to like go join the universal consciousness, whatever. So that was a change that was big enough that I remembered, at least because it was a recent game.
Edwin, do you want to tackle this?
In general, I'm also what people sometimes call a bad idea generator. I come up with a dozen ideas, and half of them have to be discarded right away because they're bad. Other of them have to be discarded after a little bit of discussion to realize that they're bad. But occasionally, you get good ones that slip through. And part of the my approach to that is to not get too attached to any one specific idea. Of course, that's easier said than done. But I try to do that. I can think of one time where I was trying to put some sort of artificial structure on a game, then try to set up some analogies between various segments of game, and draw like a little grid and the structure, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And people had to tell me, no, drop it. This is not going anywhere. And I was sad, but I had to let go of it.
Chris, any thoughts?
Oh, I never kill my babies. I lock them in a little room somewhere and maybe take them out later. I think some of the collaboration is really good for helping you identify which are the darlings that really need to be killed. It's one of the reasons why you collaborate. During a lot of discussions, I can't really say how many times my co-writer said, "No, Chris." There were like threads of like, "No, Chris, no, Chris, no, Chris." And like, okay, yeah, maybe that was too extreme. Like, you were kidding, right? No, seriously, take that idea. I think, particularly with a superhero game, it's hard to understand where too much is too much, because too much is kind of the goal you're going for. So really, I think the babies that we had to, the darlings that I really had to kill were things that could not be replicated in a real game sense way, where we just couldn't play out a scene that worked that way. So might have been awesome, but another game. Yeah, always the darlings go into another game.
And it looks like Susan has another thought.
Only because I was just looking at my brainstorms page and noticed that there was one game that has "Do not ever write this game" written next to it. So,
do you want to tell us what that game is, or is it too private?
it's called Water Wars. It was about, a near future eco-apocalypse scenario where the United States has devolved into wars over water rights.
All right. So there are currently no questions in the queue, and we're pretty close to time. So I think I'm going to call it here. Thanks everybody for coming and being with us. Thank you very much to our panelists. And stay safe. Keep LARPing online if you can. Keep thinking about writing for the day when we don't have to be online anymore. And we will be bringing you more activities someday.